Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome you to today's event, Beyond the Bookshelf - with Pardis Mondavi. Please share your questions in chat with the option for everyone. Questions will be addressed from the chat. Thank you for coming, and I will now pass the presentation to Joyce Martin, who will share the ASU Library Indigenous Land Acknowledgement and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Patty. The ASU Library acknowledges the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Acamel, O'odham, and Peepash Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. ASU Library acknowledges the sovereignty of these nations and seeks to foster an environment of success and possibility for Native American students and patrons. We are advocates for the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge systems and research methodologies within contemporary library practice. ASU Library welcomes members of the Acamel, O'odham, and Peepash and all Native nations to the library. And welcome to ASU Library Beyond the Bookshelf. Today, we're featuring a conversation with author and distinguished scholar, Dr. Pardis Mondavi, who is here to talk with us about her 2021 book, Hyphen. Hyphen sheds light on the punctuation mark, but at its heart, this book explores identity and the self and introduces us to several individuals on a journey to embrace the power of the hyphen in their own lives. This extraordinary book is part memoir, part ethnography, part history, and I am really looking forward to our conversation this afternoon. It is my honor to welcome and introduce our guests today. Dr. Pardis Mondavi is the Dean of Social Science in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University and is transitioning to her new role as Provost at the University of Montana. Dr. Mondavi's approach to higher education has been informed by her personal journey as an Iranian American woman growing up in the US, as well as her training as an anthropologist. She has focused her academic career on diversity, inclusion, human trafficking, migration, sexuality, human rights, feminism, and public health. Dr. Mondavi will be speaking today with Mimo Banani. Mimo is a social science librarian at ASU Library. Mimo supports students and faculty with research consultation and collection selection. He specializes in anthropology, archaeology, museum studies, women and gender studies, global health, justice and social inquiry, and urban planning. Please take it away, Mimo.
Thanks, Joyce. Pardis, welcome. We're so excited that you're going to be part of this today, and we all read your book, the gaggle of us, the catalog librarian, the group of us, and really loved it. It was a really great story, history, and it was fantastic. So I want to start off with a question about the series. It's a book series entitled Object Lessons, about everyday objects. It's a really terrific series. Actually, I want to read the bookshelf series because librarian, right? But the hyphen is the book is unusual in a way. It's part history, but not. It's part ethnography, but not. It's very unique in the way you wrote it and the way you interwove all the ideas and stories together. How did you come up with this idea for this type of narrative?
Well, first, let me just take a moment to thank you so much. Thank you to Joyce and to Patricia and to the entire library team for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here to talk with you all about Hyphen. I've had the chance to talk about the book with a lot of audiences, but not really at home. And so it feels like a really important full circle for me. So thank you. And to Mimo, thank you so much for reading the book with so much, passion and care. That means a lot to me that the book resonated with you. So really just a lot of gratitude and thank you to everybody who's joining us today. The challenge with these webinars is that I can't see you, but please know that I'm wanting to connect with you and eager to hear your questions. So thank you for being here. With regards to your question, how did I get the idea? So I should say that the Object Lessons series is a series that really resonates deeply with me. I'm a big fan of the series because for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they are sort of short, elegant books. You can actually hold them in your hand, which I think is quite nice. But what they do really well is they take academic research and they bridge it out to a larger community. And I feel like that is a lesson that really resonates with the charter of ASU, which is about access. And so it's about taking knowledge and making it more accessible. And so for me, that was a series that deeply resonated with me and with my values as well. I also thought it was really interesting that they created a series around objects, right? So for those of you who aren't as familiar with the series, my favorite is called High Heel. There's called Hotel, there's Remote Control, there's
Refrigerator.
Yeah. Exactly. But then, they also take on, not necessarily objects that are tangible.
Right.
And so, for me, actually, another favorite of mine is by another ASU author, Ayanna Thompson, and the book is called Blackface. And so you should definitely do a series with her. You should read the book. What I love about that book is, it might be, when you see these books, on a bookshelf, you might think, oh, small, well, it's light reading. And of course, if you think about Blackface, of course, it's not going to be light, but it is accessible. And I think that is a really important component of the series. So I should say that the idea came to me when I myself was wanting to bridge in yet another way. I kind of, as I talk about in the book, I see myself as a living bridge and the hyphen as a bridge. But I wanted to bridge out really and start writing for wider audiences. I have been doing that as a journalist kind of on and off for over 20 years, but I wanted to write a book that was a bridge to, more accessibility. And the book that's coming out actually in July is a fully trade book. It's called This Goes Out to the Underground. And it kind of is, this was the kind of crossing over, and then that sort of crossed over. But in terms of the idea for the book, it really came from a series of conversations with my editors, the editors of the series. And I talked a lot with them about this concept of belonging and how I felt like I was neither here nor there and really living inside the hyphen. And I said, if I were ever to do, an object lessons book, the object I'd write about is the hyphen. And then that kind of led me down this path.
That's great. Yeah. The book has a lot of stories and narratives about students and you yourself as a character in the book too. But it also includes a really fascinating look at the history of the hyphen as well. So I was wondering if you can discuss the origin, the early history of the hyphen in the Greek texts, and how the Celtic scribes played a really big part in changing the hyphen's function, and Mr. Gutenberg, like what happened. It's fascinating what he did with the hyphen. It's a really great story. But yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Well, so I should say that, for me, I didn't plan to write a book that was something of a marriage between orthography and ethnography.
Right.
But for me, I really wanted to understand the journey of the hyphen. And so, and why it was that the hyphen dropped out of certain hyphenated identities. So as an Iranian American, we are hyphenated. Many of us are hyphenated. But then, my partner who's Chinese American and many of my close friends who are Japanese American, there's no hyphen there. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to get a deeper understanding. And so when you only go as far back as World War II, and you look at John Wayne, which I talk a lot about, and you look at Roosevelt and Wilson, you see that the anti-hyphenism comes right around this sort of time of xenophobia. You've got Wilson and Roosevelt and later John Wayne saying a hyphenated American is not an American at all. And so the idea was that the hyphens signaled divided loyalties or divided identities, which was troubling to me. But I was ecstatic when I actually went all the way back to start to figure out where the hyphen came from as an orthographic mark. So, for those who haven't read the book, the hyphen was actually invented by an ancient Greek grammarian by the name of Dionysius Thrax, who was wandering the halls of the Alexandria Library.
By the way, he has the coolest name ever.
I know. Dionysius Thrax. It's so better than the other grammarians.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so, he was wandering the halls. He was a poet at heart, like Gutenberg. And so we see that sometimes these different aspects of our identity play a role in what, kind of the way our futures unfold. So he was really puzzled as to how he could signal two separate words that belonged together. Now, as a hyphenated person who's been searching for belonging my whole life and trying to figure out, do I fit on one side or the other of the hyphen? This notion of the hyphen as being a signal of belonging was an incredible discovery for me. And so Dionysius Thrax was writing at the time when readers would actually sing words. So you might have as a reader, you'd have a text, and instead of speaking it, you would sing it. And he was trying to figure out how to send a signal to the reader that there were two separate words which belonged together. And so he created the very first hyphen, which was actually a sublinear U-shaped, kind of almost like a bow, U-shaped hyphen that was underneath to signal belonging. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, over time, this starts to change, and you actually have the Celtic monks coming in and saying, okay, well, wait a minute, like our non-native Greek or Latin brains are not necessarily understanding it. And so they start to actually morph the way that the hyphen is used. Now, you asked about Gutenberg. Yeah. So Gutenberg comes in, everybody's probably most familiar with Gutenberg for the Gutenberg Bible, right? And he's credited with having invented the printing press. So Gutenberg himself came from a family of blacksmiths, but at his heart, he was a poet. And so he had these two identities that he was kind of lost betwixt and between, which again resonates deeply with me. And so he actually invented the printing press so that he could write poetry. When he wanted to print the poetry, he was also an artist. And so he wanted perfectly justified lines on a page. And that was when he started to deploy the hyphen, because to get the perfect justification, you do need to break words. And so he actually started using the hyphen. He's the one who probably popularized it the most after you had the period of the Celtic monks. So to me, it's a fascinating history, because everybody who's been involved with the way the hyphen has evolved has also had a search or questions around belonging, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, and so in his case, it was the use of it was like for example, the word writing.
Yeah,
you write WRIT and then dash.
Correct.
So then then I have to the words not. So it's not. He was bridging the word itself. Yeah, that's a different type of use of hyphen. Yeah, and he himself is
is a hyphen. Individual himself, right?
Yeah, exactly. Blacksmith, poet. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah, and also, in the book I chronicle his life, right, where he had these heavy expectations from his parents to marry and to take over the family business. And that's a big part of his conflicted identity, as is the case with the characters throughout the book, who have these moments of, who am I, where do I belong? And the most pivotal moments tend to be when they hit these tension points with their families.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We wanted to get that story in there too.
Yeah, and that actually leads to our next question. Really enjoy the use of vignettes in the story of the students to illustrate bicultural lives. Can you talk about the three individuals in the story, Daniel, Adeshike, and Ania, and how you wove their narratives into the book and why?
Well, first, let me say it was very hard to narrow it down to just a few interlocutors. I've spent, years interviewing hyphenated, individuals. Not necessarily, I hadn't gone in with this project in mind. I actually really was, and I got a grant for a project entitled "What Does It Mean to Be an American?" And so I had begun interviewing my students and other individuals who identified as hyphenated Americans in one way or another. And so I had a very hard time figuring out, okay, which three am I going to pick? And the other thing I should say is throughout the course of the research, I met individuals who identified as hyphenated that I maybe wouldn't have thought were hyphenated. And I remember very vividly there was one, and I had a wonderful student assisting me throughout the project. And I walked into the office, and my student assistant said, "Yeah, there's someone wanting to be in this project, and he's waiting to see you, but I don't think he's going to fit. And but good luck." And so I walked in, and it was an appearing straight white male who identified as straight, and I said, "Okay, well, thank you for." Your interest in this project, you identified as a hyphenated American. And he said, "Yes, I'm rural American." And I thought, this was not an identity I would have thought necessarily, right? And he says, "And I also identify as, being of a different class. And I think that impacts my experience as an American." And I was like, absolutely, that's definitely true. And so I should say that, while the hyphen typically connects to, different identities, everybody has these many layers of identities, right? And it can't necessarily be captured in Iranian American, because I would say I'm Iranian American, woman, academic, mother. There's so many aspects of our hyphenation. But one of the things I learned in and through this project is that, as different as we all may be, one of the things many of us share is that we are all hyphenated in one way or another. And so
we all are. I totally agree.
Yeah, exactly. So, to choose these three was a very difficult task. But these were individuals that I had spent a lot of time with, whose stories I thought really mapped the trajectory of the orthography, right?
Mhm.
So if you look at the history of the hyphen, of the orthography of the hyphen, it starts out as something to signal belonging.
Right.
Dionysius Thrax, Gutenberg.
Yeah.
Then you hit World War II, where it actually is something that divides.
A divider, yeah.
Right? And then you actually get to the 2000s and since, where it's actually the creator of something new entirely.
Right.
And the three individuals I picked, their lives had taken a very similar kind of journey, as had my own, right? Whereas like, you have these moments of belonging and etc. And then you've got this break where you're like, I don't fit in either, I don't belong anywhere. And then you kind of graduate to this point where you're like, actually, I don't have to fit on one side or the other of the hyphen. The hyphen is something that creates something new altogether, right? And that's what we saw in like the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, where the hyphen was removed from words and people said, well, does that mean it's not useful? No, it means it created something new. So the example of bumblebee, I think, is very salient there. There's so many words we could pick, but I like bumblebee, so I'll go with that one. So you had bumble space bee, and then for years you had bumble hyphen bee, and now it's bumblebee. Another word that you all probably use every day is email. It used to be E space mail, then E hyphen mail, and some of you probably still use E hyphen mail, and then some people just write email. So it's not that the hyphen isn't useful, it's that it acts as this bridge, and then it creates something new altogether. And the journey of these three individuals kind of mirrored that orthographic journey.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too how in some cultures, like the email, probably because it's a borrowed word, like in Italy, they still do e-mail.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, but that whole example that you came up with the SOED, just for everybody else, the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, what happened was one of the principal editors decided that the hyphen is, because of the internet and because of colloquial and common usage, YouTube, etc. It's not necessary as like it used to be. So they removed the hyphen from 16,000 entries in the SOED. So we lost the hyphen. But in your book, Pardis, you talk about, stress how how the hyphen is incredibly still important, and but there are no hard rules. How would you? I'm interested though in what do you think of the hyphen yourself, and how do you, because of the researching in this book, do you have a different interpretation of the hyphen? Like, do you use it more often now, or do you try hard to use the hyphen?
I think I do use it more often. The other thing I love is when I meet when I meet people who have actual hyphens in their last name. And most of them have a story around it, right? Like the last time I did a book talk was actually for the Iranian American Society of Arizona. And someone said, listen, they changed my last name and I never knew why. And they put this hyphen, but now I know because they were Jewish Iranian shopkeepers and they were trying to assimilate that they changed it. And it was, and he learned that because he read the book and then he went back into his history and kind of made all these discoveries, which I, that's amazing to me, right? I think I definitely use the hyphen more than before because I do think that it has this power and it has this importance. And so, when the editor of the Shorter Oxford English Dictionary decided to remove it, I think what's important to note, though, is that he was removing it because the hyphen had done its job, which was to create something new altogether, right? To create, so you have way station. So the hyphen had been a way station itself, but way station, the word, it used to be way space station because you have a way and you have a station, but you needed the hyphen to be able to connect the two for a while. So then it was way hyphen station. And then as language is an evolving thing, right? And so as we got more and more used to seeing way connected to station by this tiny little orthographic mark, then that mark became unnecessary. But now we may use the hyphen for other words that we weren't necessarily putting together, right? I also think that it is absolutely the case that the hyphen will remain in certain words, such as mother-in-law or ex-boyfriend. I don't anybody wants to speak to those two words anytime soon.
Ex-husband,
exactly. So I think that that the hyphen can be an interesting and important bridge.
Still serves an important role.
I think it absolutely does. Yeah.
I've been using, in the short time since I read your book, I've been using the hyphen a lot more than I used to, like on purpose. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
I wanted to talk a little bit about names in the book, and your name. It made me think of my name, which is Domenico. It's very Italian. My nickname is Mimo. But how the pronunciation of a name actually can bring up feelings of emotion or being in the in-between cultures, right? Being caught in between the two cultures. So, growing up, I would try to explain my name to people, it's Domenico, or Nico, and then I gave up after a while, and then I came to the point where, everybody calls me Mimo, which is like a nickname in Italian. So I felt that was my identity. So then I asked everybody just to call me Mimo, and that was great. Worked out really, really well. In the book, Adeshike and his coach and his father, call him Addy, which is not. It represents a huge shift in his life. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own experiences with your name, and how it may have caused a shift in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, Adeshike's story definitely resonated with my own, right? So I have a name that's very difficult. I mean, you talk about your name, that definitely resonates with me too. Domenico, Paradis. Yeah. Paradis is my name, and yet everybody, when they look at it written, it's just Pardis. And to me, that sounds ugly to my ear. It doesn't, and so, when people would call me Pardis, I think at first I wouldn't correct them because I didn't really have the language or the vocabulary to do so. And then then I sort of would say Pardis because that was my way of anglicizing my name. But then, I think hearing the stories of my interlocutors, I was like, well, why do I keep anglicizing it? My name is Paradis. It's not that hard, and I think that, I definitely resonate with the Adeshike because when teachers tried to read my name or pronounce my name, they would get it. I always knew in school, like they'd be reading the names, they'd be like Mary Beth, Patricia, and then they'd be like They would just kind of stop, and I was like, oh dear, that's
Yeah,
definitely,
I could totally relate.
yeah. But I will say the other part of, as I've kind of grown into adulthood, or kind of, in my current life, I think the thing that happens most often to me is people read and see my name. And I will tell you that I cannot, the number of times the following has happened to me is really just too much for comfort, where people will meet me and they'll say, oh, I thought you were a man.
Mm,
And I'm like, and I understand that my name might not, didn't, denote a particular gender
right.
in English, but I have to wonder, like, what about the whole package deal made them think I was a man? And so that's been an interesting experience of unbelonging. But what I've also learned to appreciate is that, like, that a name and the uniqueness of a name allows for you to kind of play with different identities too, which is,
Yeah,
that's the whole point of the hyphen as well.
yeah. And indirectly kind of teaches you to play with different identities and be accepting of different identities. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, in the book, there are early stories with Daniel and Adeshike where the word honor and dishonor are used quite a bit by their parents. Like Daniel's mother says, "You're not my child. You are a disgrace to the ancestors who are supposed to be honoring. You dishonor the ancestors. You dishonor yourself." And Adeshike's mother says, "You're a man would never dishonor his mother this way. You are losing your way." Um, and then there's a part of the story of the book where Adeshike has to face being a football player, whether to kneel or not during a football game. Could you discuss honor and dishonor, the whole concept, and the struggle that these young people were going through, being bicultural, being part of two cultures, and your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was sort of these twin themes of honor, betrayal, right? So you've
Right.
got honor on the one side, and then this notion that you're somehow betraying your ancestors, right? By you're dishonoring them. And I think that was as an anthropologist, when we do interviews, we take field notes, we code, right? And the number of times that honor and betrayal came up in these interviews was astounding. And it's something that I've experienced in my life too. So there's often been this narrative that if I start to sway too much towards, let's say, the American side of my identity, there's this really strong pull from my parents that says, well, you're dishonoring your aunt, you're dishonoring your Iranianness. And I think the hard thing for me was never knowing where that line was, right? Never knowing, okay, so why is wearing makeup dishonoring my culture? And I think you see, Adechike and Danielle, going through the same thing, which is, Danielle asking, themselves, like, is my being gay dishonoring my culture, and why? Right. And so I think that that's a really disorienting experience, this feeling that having these two identities, that if you start to lean more towards one versus the other, you're betraying. And I should say that many years later, my daughter said something to me that really drove this point home. My daughter, in 2016, she was only 6 years old. And this was around when Trump was being elected. And she came home from school one day, and she said, you know, uh, this little boy in my class said that as soon as we get Trump, the rest of you will be sent home. And she looked at me and she's like where would we go, Mom? Because she knew I'd been kicked out of Iran, and I was born in the US and she was born in the US. And so she's like, where would we go? And then my son asked, well, why is there this issue? And I said, well, Iran and America are kind of for a long time been at war. And then he said, well, what about those of us who are Iran and America in one body?
Yeah, good question.
And I
Good question
think
by both, by the way.
yeah, and I think that's really what a lot of this gets at, is what happens when you have these warring identities. Can the hyphen sort of soothe some of that inner conflict by allowing you to say, well, I don't have to fit into one or the other, and not fitting in isn't a betrayal, but
Right.
rather I'm just something else altogether.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. You're not being torn to the Iranian, if it's the word Iranian-American. You're not being torn
Right.
towards the left. You're
Right.
not being towards the right. You're in the middle,
Right.
in the living in the hyphen.
Inside,
Yeah,
and that can be a like it's
cozy like a little bed.
yes, exactly, and a bridge.
Yeah, right.
But it can be a powerful place to live. I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
we all spend all this time, talking about liminality, neither here nor there, betwixt and between. You hear Anaya in the book talk about ni the aquí, ni the allá. Like it's a theme that keeps coming up, and it's because we keep trying to fit like one place or the other, rather than saying, wait a second, many of us can live like a bridge is a place, right?
Exactly.
The hyphen is a place, and we can live there too. And it has a tremendous power that it's had for centuries, by the way.
Yeah, very powerful. And it can be very powerfully divisive too when it's not, when be there or not there. I thought I was kind of shocking when you had the chapter on John Wayne singing a song about the hyphenated American, and then Teddy Roosevelt in his speech on Columbus Day in 1915. When I was reading that, I was like, oh God, I didn't realize he said all this stuff. Well, let me read it for the audience.
Please.
The part of it. I won't read the entire thing, I promise. Here's a quote. This is Teddy Roosevelt. The men who do not become Americans and nothing else are hyphenated Americans, and there ought to be no room for them in this country. He's talking about the United States. For an American citizen to vote as a German American, an Irish American, or an English American, it is to be a traitor to American institutions, and those hyphenated Americans who terrorize American politicians by threats of the foreign vote are engaged in treason to the American Republic. So this whole concept of hyphenated Americanism, which you talk about in a really great chapter called Scolding Private Hyphen, by the way, great title. Can you talk about politicians, John Wayne, and their reactions to the hyphen at the time?
Yeah. Yeah, so here you have that notion of betrayal on the other side of the hyphen. So while Danny, Anaya, Adachike, and my family, like let's say there's this notion that we were betraying the Iranian side or the Chinese side or the Nigerian side. Here you've got the politicians and this heavy political rhetoric saying, no, you're a betrayal, you're a traitor
Right.
to America because you've got this hyphen, right? This tiny marker makes you a traitor. And so what you see is how the orthography is so deeply connected to the politics, right? And to the xenophobia. And so, you have this strong anti-hyphenism that emerges, and this notion of the hyphen signifies divided loyalties, right? John Wayne says it, a hyphenated American is not an American. And so what do you do with that? What do you do with that, given the fact that really it's truly only indigenous folks can say that they're really American? So everybody else is a hyphen, like including those politicians themselves. They're
Right.
Irish American.
Including Teddy Roosevelt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And John Wayne. I mean,
Yeah.
And so this idea that a hyphenated American is not an American, it's like, well, why do you get to say that? And then to think about the domino effect of that rhetoric and how profound it was on the lives of so many hyphenated individuals. And then to see kind of, then the next chapter like talks about how it starts to spiral. So, you had a hyphen set in stone. This anti-hyphenism called for the removal of hyphens from any number of words. So for instance, many of you here are probably avid readers of the New York Times. What you may not know is that it used to be written because the state of New York, New Jersey, etc., were all New hyphen York, New hyphen Jersey. These words were hyphenated. But because of the xenophobia and the politics around the hyphen, they pulled the hyphen out of words like New York. And so the New York Times, which was written the New hyphen York Times, just became the New York Times as you see it today. However, you have the New York Historical Society, where the title of the society was carved in stone. So it was New hyphen York Historical Society, their hyphen was carved in stone on the outside of their building. And this caused an absolute uproar. And I loved the way that the New York Historical Society responded, which was like, no, it's history. Why would we take it out? You know? And by the way, their baseball team is actually the hyphen. So, you know,
That's great.
I know, I just loved that response. But it just goes to show you how orthography, politics, and how it all gets wrapped together in really complicated ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm fascinated by how authors write and in the actual the process of what you do and how the writing actually takes place. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit of, you know, when you write, how do you write? Do you use no paper? Do you use a typewriter? Do you have a typewriter? Oh my God, I'm dating myself. Do you use a computer? Yeah. Well, maybe you use a typewriter. I don't know. Maybe you like typewriting.
I am a pen and paper gal. I gotta be honest. So I've got like probably thousands of these journals now by now. So as an anthropologist, I take field notes. I rely on my field notes, but then you know, for coding reasons, I often have to type those up. But to write a book like this, to any of the books that I write, I absolutely begin by outlining with pen and paper. I sometimes will have multiple sheets of paper that I sort of tape on the walls or tape on the floor, and I'm moving chapters around, or I'm moving ideas around as a book is, you know, an idea is germinating in my head. My kids always know. They're like, oh, you're brainstorming a new book, you're brainstorming a new book. They know, and sometimes they'll move stuff around, you know. But I very much, I very much outline, like I do a large outline of the book, and then I outline every single chapter all by hand before I actually sit down to type.
Does it help you focus? Like, does that type of writing, physically hand on paper, help you focus?
Absolutely. It's just how I think best, you know.
Right.
And there's a lot of like diagramming, like circles,
Sure.
like this line connects to this line connects to this line, this idea connects to this idea. So I definitely have to see the book kind of written and sort of taped up, but before I actually dive in to do the writing. And I will say that lots of outlining to me makes the writing process less daunting, right? Because you sit down and you open up a blank document, but you've got your outline, right? And so you're like, okay, well, here's where I'm going. And then I write the stories on index cards. I just write summaries of the stories of the individuals I want to highlight, and I kind of slot those in. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I write every day. I should also say, like, I know people say, well, people say you should do that, but is that really real? For me, it is. I write every day.
Is that like part of your, like, you wouldn't feel right if you didn't write every day?
That's
like, it's just part of you.
It's just part of me.
Yeah. That's great.
Every morning, 5:30 in the morning, I'm writing.
So you mentioned ethnography, coding. I have anthropology degree, and I'm the anthropology librarian here at ACU Library. You have a quote, a Margaret Mead quote, which I love. It speaks to me, but make the strange familiar and the familiar strange.
Yeah.
So basically, the interpretation of that is you're trying to understand an unfamiliar culture and context, and making the familiar strange means you're that our own culture can be seen differently by others. But what does this quote mean to you in the context of the book?
For me, you know, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career writing about what we might call the other, like writing about Iran, or, you know, my field site was Iran, then, you know, human trafficking in Dubai, and then, you know, intergenerational and stateless children in the Gulf, you know, and so it was very much, and so it was really that making the strange familiar, right? That first part of that Margaret Mead quote, which is like, look, you know, writing about a sexual revolution in Iran was like about showing my students that their counterparts in Iran are having the same conversations that they are, which I think was significant, right? But I also think we reached a tipping point where it was time to make the familiar strange, right? And I think it was time to sort of turn the ethnographic gaze on ourselves, right? And so, and for me, you mentioned how it's part memoir. It also seemed like I have spent 20 years writing other people's stories. It's time I start to put myself out there a little bit. And because people have been rightfully critical of anthropologists who just make careers off of other people's lives, and I'm like, that's true. We should probably turn some of that critique on ourselves, and our own families, etc. And so that was the memoir piece of it, which then translated to my upcoming book, which is all memoir. And I just put myself all out there, but I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not written Hyphen. So had I not kind of flirted with bits and pieces of memoir coming out in this, I wouldn't have been able to write a full-blown memoir like I did. So this book in and of itself was a bridge for me, a bridge from academic writing to trade writing, and a kind of trade writing that's more honest and about putting yourself out there.
When you were memoir, in writing this upcoming memoir that you're writing, which you're probably going to talk, I think, about what happened to you at 9/11, and when you're a co-editor of Slant magazine and a graduate student at Columbia. That piece in the book is it's very poetic and striking, and your own personal experience, what you went through, and your co-editor, the two of you. I was just wondering, and we were wondering, was this a personal experience, a catalyst to write, one of the catalysts to write this book, and then potentially memoir?
There were a couple of main catalysts that appear in this book as well. That was definitely like the first.
Okay.
The earliest one that I can remember, it was 9/11, and that feeling of like, oh my goodness, I am not safe on the streets of New York, So that was a really, and it was something I had carried with me. Like, it was an angst that I'd carried with me for so long that somehow writing it in this book released it.
It was cathartic.
Was incredibly cathartic. Right. And so I actually don't write about it in This Goes Out to the Underground. Rather, This Goes Out to the Underground focuses on my arrest, which I do also write about in this book, my arrest in Iran, where I was held under house arrest for 33 days. And that was also, I had locked that away. I had locked that experience away. I had never written about it until Hyphen. And it's funny because, I have friends who are so close to me from all over the world who they didn't even know that had happened to me. My closest friends and family obviously did, but I have friends who write to me and they've read the book and they're like, I didn't know that happened. And I said, yeah, this is happening right around this time. And I just had never faced it. And so it really was my arrest. And This Goes Out to the Underground really walks through my time in the underground of Iran, what led to my arrest, and then actually kind of picks up at where, after I was married, my daughter was young, my ex-husband kidnapped my daughter, and I had to rely on my former captor, who's introduced in Hyphen, Sumac. I had to rely on him as well as the human trafficking networks that I had developed to get my daughter back. So that's really what the memoir focuses on. But all of that, I would not have had the strength, I would say. I wasn't brave enough to write that had I not started with the 9/11 scene, because I that experience of myself with, and he's now a major journalist based in Cairo and with the New York Times of all outlets. I'm like, there's no Hyphen. But our experience was something that I think both of us felt ashamed when it all happened, and we had sort of carried it in this awkward way, so I think writing it down, just like writing down then the experiences of my arrest, getting kicked out, and then basically surviving domestic violence many years later with my ex-husband, it became a way for me to process trauma that I had been holding on to.
Yeah. that whole chapter was really powerful, and what you went through at the University of Tehran, the lecture, and then being kidnapped, and the interrogation for, how long was the interrogation?
33 days.
33 days. That was very powerful. And then during that time, you remember you saying in the chapter that we began to impact, the power comes from within inside the hyphen itself. So when you were being interrogated, is that where the idea of how the hyphen can act as a bridge, that you are an Iranian and an American?
Yeah, well, I think that was the moment where I realized how much power the hyphen had. I was like,
Makes sense.
wow, I am a real threat to this regime, which is so much bigger than me, purely because of that hyphen.
Right.
I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of power here. Maybe
Yeah.
find a way to actually harness that power to heal ourselves and to help find belonging.
Right.
But it was that being arrested and being interrogated that I started to realize the weight that such a tiny orthographic mark carries.
It's really incredible, right? That this tiny little mark can have so much power,
Yes.
and be a divider and a unifier and a bridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet it can threaten some of the most powerful, like an entire authoritarian regime. I was like, you're threatened by me? How is that possible, you know?
Right. The end of the book, spoiler, by the way, for the folks who haven't read it, it ends on very positively. It has a really nice ending, a lovely ending. Everyone is gathered at the end for a talk that's happening here at ASU with School of Social Transformation. And Danielle, and Aeneas, after Danielle gives a presentation, Ania, one of the other characters in the vignettes in the story, she says a really great quote: every American is a hyphenated American, and every American is on a journey, which you talk about throughout the book. So we get to see them in a special way at the end as being the hyphenated. Danielle, Adeshike, Zach, Ania, and how they use the hyphen to bridge their two different cultures that they live within themselves, to have a unique identity. Do you think we're all on this journey, as Ania says, to try to find belonging in life? Sorry, that might be a heavy question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is a heavy question. It's also a really salient question. I don't think I have I don't know that I have a clear answer. I certainly can tell you, I'm definitely feel like I'm on a journey. I can tell you that the hundreds of people I interviewed for this project of what does it mean to be an American, a hyphenated American, they're all on this journey. And I think that one of the things we're seeing with the rise of, very much needed conversations around justice, equity, diversity, inclusion is the sort of, elevation of visibility around unbelonging, and the real, the fact that there's a real call and a real hunger to give weight to belonging as such an integral part of everyday life, whether it's in academia, in an institution, or in a business, or in an industry, or in a community, right? We're starting to, as a society, have conversations about belonging. And I think they're very long overdue, but I think that they also reflect that so many of us are on this journey, and we're now starting to talk about it.
Yeah, it's a great catalyst to bring up this conversation, discussion amongst society, that what does it mean to be belonging? What does it mean to have an identity? Yeah, exactly.
And also at a time when, as a society, we are also very divided. We are very, I was writing this book under a previous administration, which was a time of intense division, right? And at a time when we have this strong polarization, are there things that might bridge us? The fact that we are all hyphenated, might that be an invitation to come together, to have a conversation about all of us as being hyphenated? Might that be something to actually join and create?
Yeah. Pretties, we need the hyphen. We all need to live in the hyphen. It's so true.
I think so.
Yeah. I think that's a good question to end my questions for you.
Okay.
But I want to open up the questions before I do that though, what I wanted to say is that the library, Raquel Lequette Moore put together a really wonderful book exhibit based on the book. And it's available. Well, I'm gonna stop talking and I'll let Raquel talk about it. Raquel, could you turn on your and tell us a little bit about the book exhibit?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Raquel Lequette Moore and I work at the OpenStax unit at the library. What you see behind me is actually a photo of that featured collection that I put together with your Paradis. So featured collections, thank you, and thank you for that. Featured collections are arranged around specific topics and are curated with us, librarians, and community members of ASU, including faculty, students, and staffs. I'm so sorry, and staff. Everyone is invited to contribute. So I contacted Dr. Mahdavi, and she gave me a list of a few books that will complement Hyphen. And I added a few more. We ended up with about 100 books of what you see behind me. And the books in this collection open a window into the cultural diversity of hyphenated Americans, spanning multiple dimensions of ethnic, linguistic, racial, ancestral, gender, religious, and migrant identities. Living in between amongst these simultaneous selves rather than exclusively committing to any of them is explored in the book Hyphen through personal journeys and reflections on the political history of this tiny but mighty typographic mark. So the collection is inspired by the book, and the books that Dr. Mahdavi gave me to add include Semicolon, The Past, Present, and Future of a Misunderstood Mark by Cecilia Watson, Lipstick Jihad, a memoir of growing up Iranian in America and American in Iran by
Azadeh Moaveni. Yeah.
Thank you. I practiced it. Thank you. And Wordslat, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language by Amanda Montero. I added a few other books, such as Asian North American Identities Beyond the Hyphen by Jennifer Lee, Dionysus Trax and his Technique Dramatique by Vivian Lowe, Not Quite American, The Shaping of Arab and Muslim Identity in the United States by Yvonne Yazbek Haddad, and Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual by Robert Ray Farr. So this collection is available on the second floor of Hayden Library next to the San Diego Reads collection. We also have another collection on the fourth floor of ASU authors. And again, we are inclusive. We include faculty, students, and staff. And you're welcome to explore that on the fourth floor. And I enjoyed very much your book.
This is very exciting. Thank you so much. I want to come see it.
Me too.
You're welcome to
Sure.
I can't wait to check it out. Literally, check out books. So I'm going to transition over to Raquel and Brad, and they're going to field questions from the audience. So Brad and Raquel, do you have any questions?
I can start, sure. So we have a few questions so far in the chat, so I'm going to start with those. First one's kind of a grammar question from Matt Ockmore, and he says that he often edits for people who get hyphens, in dashes, and m dashes confused. And did either of those dashes complicate the hyphen at all as you were thinking about this and researching?
Yes, well, that's a great question, Matt, because the history of M dashes and N dashes is completely different, right? It doesn't have this same, that sublinear bow, etc. And you're right, people do switch them. We can also give a little bit of blame to Mr. Gutenberg, because there were definitely times where he was using a hyphen when he should have been using an M or an N dash, and grammarians have actually been pretty public about that. So that history gets a little bit complicated there. I definitely saw that when I was, there is a kind of a final orthographic chapter where I talk about, this time I spent at Google where they were coding. They were trying to figure out the code for hyphen, and they kept mixing up the code for the hyphen versus the M dash versus the N dash. So that probably made your job, Matt, even harder, because the actual way in which it was coded in computer language was also mixed up. And that was because the coders weren't necessarily paying attention to the difference. So yes, I definitely saw that.
Great, thank you.
Jackie Young asked a couple of questions that relate to each other and talk about the therapeutic power of writing. You said you write daily. Did you find that writing about traumatic events or stressful events in your own life helped you on your healing journey? And as a follow-up, do you think your book could be helpful in reducing the polarization around the issue of immigration and immigration reform?
Wow, two excellent questions. Thank you, Jackie. So in terms of writing and trauma, I think that writing, you have to be careful because it also brings up the trauma. So you have to be ready to deal with it. Now, most, actually all of this current book, Hyphen, all of the book was written during the pandemic. So that added a layer of complexity for me, because there I am writing about trauma while also living a different kind of trauma, right? And the pandemic, 2020, triple pandemic, right? You had the viral pandemic, you had the very real social pandemic of racism, and then you had climate emergencies when the planet was is burning. I mean, none of these have gone away. And then you're quarantined, right? And writing. And I found that it was both cathartic and healing to be able to do that. And it was also challenging, to be honest, to relive that trauma. So, for me, it was also really important to highlight not only intergenerational trauma, but also to find the wells and the reserves of intergenerational strength. And so, my memoir that comes out this July, this goes out to the underground, it's a lot about intergenerational trauma, but the book I'm writing right now is actually about intergenerational strength. And I think it's important in and through these writing processes that we have these fountains of strength to drink from, because that trauma is real. Now, I should also say that the writing and being able to enter these worlds and enter these other worlds has provided for me a level of sanity as an administrator, like as a leader. Being able to be in these worlds and to write has absolutely helped me to be a better and more kind of empathic leader. So I think that that's important as well. In terms of, do I think my book could be helpful in reducing the polarization around immigration? I would hope so. I mean, the idea behind but at the same time, like I'm also aware of the limitations of books, but I do want to say that I think, my hope with this book was that it would be a bridge, not only for me, but that it would be a bridge between individuals, that people could pick this up. Two people from completely different, worlds could read it and could connect around this book, and could connect around all experiencing hyphenism, being hyphenated, and and talk about how that's impacted their lives. And my hope was, make the strange familiar and the familiar strange, that this would also be an invitation for people to start to think about the lives of people very different than them and to actually connect. So I guess that's kind of a roundabout way of saying yes.
Great. Our next question is from Joyce Martin. Joyce, since you're a panelist, you want to unmute and actually ask it?
Sure, I can absolutely do that. So my question was concerning one of the early chapters in your book. It was the first chapter, again, with great titles. So My Big Fat Persian Wedding was the title of your first chapter in this book. And in that book, or in that chapter, you talk about your father's emphasis on education. And can you discuss a little bit more the importance of the role of education in your father's life and in your life as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when people talk about what drives me as a leader, what made me an administrator, even though there's a big part of my heart and my identity that I see myself as a writer, right? So you've got that other hyphenism, writer, administrator, that these, I don't want to say warring identities anymore, but these kind of interweaving identities. I used to see them as warring. But in the book, I create a bridge between these identities where I talk about my father. My family fled Iran during the revolution. So lost absolutely everything during the revolution and were resettled in Minneapolis, of all places. And so, we were living in Minneapolis, and then in the 1980s, Iran-Contra happened. And my brother and I came home from school one day, and there was a sign posted on our front door, and it said, "Burn this house, terrorists live here." And my family felt that my father decided we had to pack up and leave Minnesota and move to California, where there were other Iranian Americans and other hyphenated Americans. And in that move, my father said something to me that really drives me as an educator. And he said, "You know what, Paradis? People can take everything from you. They can take your home, they can take your belongings, they can even take your country. But the one thing that no one can ever take from you is your education. So that is going to be your job." And that is what kind of drove me to continue. Like, to me, going to school, that was my job, right? And then I became an administrator to help others access that which can never be taken away. So, for my father, education has meant, is that the difference between life and death, being able to, for him, having access to education has meant that he has survived revolution, war, displacement. And so it became a real central theme in my life, which was, thinking about how we educate and how we make sure that we ensure access to education for all.
Thank you. That actually resonates very strongly with me. My father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor, and that's exactly what he used to tell myself and all the family. They can take everything from you except your education. Thank you. Miriam, I'm sorry, Raz, I can't read that. Rahash Shirt, my apologies. Can hyphens help international students with creative writing in English or their second language? If yes, how?
That is an excellent question, Mariam. June, thank you for asking. I want to say that, I just am such a, hyphenophile that I want to say that, yes, the hyphen can always help. I also, it's funny, as I've presented on this book in different countries, people have talked about, well, is the hyphen used a lot in Farsi, for example? And I'm like, well, it's just different because we write, as you know, Mariam, from right to left. And so it's just different. We have different ways of writing. That said, the concepts behind this orthographic this question of belonging, of words that are sutured, that can be sutured, of belonging, those are definitely concepts that translate. The hyphen itself, you don't see it as much in, let's say, ancient Persian text. So if I'm looking at the Shahnameh, right, I'm seeing less hyphens than if I'm looking at the Gutenberg Bible, right? And not to say that the hyphen isn't salient for Persian, and it definitely is as far as justification, but we signal belonging in different ways, right? And in Persian, we have, this underlying, under letters that signal two words connecting. So we have different connectors. So I think what we should do for non-native English speakers is really walk through the power of the hyphen and really, walk through how this orthographic mark, what it can signal, the power that it has, and how and why it is taken out of certain words and how and why it remains in certain words. So I think that the book can be a helpful tool for them, but I don't know about in creative writing. I defer to my creative writing colleagues on that.
I have a question. I think because we don't have any more questions from chat, but I have one. When I was reading your book, one of the things that kind of made me stop and I was like super shocked was the John Wayne story. And I'm like, what? There's a song? First of all, I didn't know John Wayne can sing, and he can't. He can't sing at all. He's basically just reading a poem in his voice.
Right. Did you go and listen to it? I hope you went and listened to it. Yeah.
That's
wild, right? The recording is wild.
That's exactly it. I immediately went on YouTube, and I'm like, holy, it's there. And I'm listening to this thing, and I'm like, I could not. I mean, it was so shocking. What was the most shocking thing for you when you were doing your research on this? Was that it, or were there other things that you were just like totally shocked about?
I think somehow the John Wayne for me wasn't the most I mean, it was, but it was more the commissioner who's sitting on the subway and sees new hyphen York and decides that's it. Like if I think of America and I think of the cities in America, I lived in New York. To me, New York is the ultimate hyphen city. Is a city full of hyphenated Americans and full of hyphenated individuals. And, that's why 9/11 hit me so hard, was because up until that moment, I felt living in New York, I was like, well, I'm amongst so many, so many of people who are like me. And so for me, the idea that you have to take the hyphen out of New York was shocking and aggravating, because if any city should be hyphenated, it's New York City, for goodness sakes. So, the outrage that this very clearly xenophobic, the commissioner had, to an extent that he was willing to risk his career to make sure the hyphen was taken out of New York on every flyer and on every building, that to me was quite shocking.
I have and since I'm an anthropology background, I'm so interested in culture. The whole chapter on Ania and children of Latina, Latinx immigrants. It was fascinating how she wanted to reclaim her culture, and she was doing it through food culture, which was really amazing, through mole, and then also learning Spanish language, and then trying to make a bridge with her mom.
Yeah.
Her mom was in a different part of her life where she was trying to let go of her Spanish past, of her culture's past. Do you see this as maybe a shift in American culture where young Americans want to explore their biculturality? Youth in diverse communities are more open to trying to make a bridge to their possible cultural past and between those two worlds?
That's an excellent question, Mimo. I think what I'm seeing a little bit more of is there's a shift. So many of us grew up in the assimilationist 80s, right? And so you either had parents like mine who were like, you will only speak Farsi in the house. You will only eat Persian, it was like, or, my partner is Chinese American. and does not speak Chinese, does not know the first thing about Chinese food, because he grew up in the assimilationist 80s. And so I think what you're seeing a little bit more now are young people whose parents are also more open to thinking about heritage. And so as these conversations around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and questions around belonging have entered the zeitgeist, if you will, that's also been an opening up for this question of heritage. You know, instead of this need to like assimilate, it's like, no, like we can celebrate. We can actually, you know, celebrate all these different parts of our identities, and we can do multiple things at once. You know, for me, growing up, I wasn't allowed to celebrate Christmas, which I was like, well, that stinks. On the flip side, my partner never celebrated Chinese New Year. Well, now we celebrate all of them, which is really fun. But I also think that, you know, there's this question of like, well, you know, who gets to say what parts of my identity resonate the loudest for me? No one, just us. We're the ones who get to define that. And I think having that freedom for a young person is incredibly important, because many of us didn't have it at the age of 18 or 20.
Yeah, it was a very powerful vignette on how she wanted to explore that and developed a new identity for herself. It was really amazing and terrific.
Yeah. I mean, and it's exactly what you said, Mimo. She was trying to find a pathway to her mom.
Right.
And, you know, to her deceased father. You know, I think it was this feeling of like, well, I think Anaya very much felt that she did not belong, you know, anywhere. And she was trying to bridge in every way that she could. And then there was this kind of moment of release when she's like, well, I can be a bunch of different things. I'm just me.
Wow, this was just a wonderful, really amazing conversation this afternoon. ASU Library would like to extend a big thank you to Dr. Pardis Mandave and Mimo Banani for bringing their energy, their enthusiasm, and expertise to today's event. We'd also like to thank all of you for attending. Today's event has been recorded and it will be available on the ASU Library YouTube channel. So please look out for that. Please share that widely with your networks, and you will receive a post-event survey. So we would appreciate it if you take a couple minutes to share your thoughts with us. And you're getting some wonderful comments in the chat, a lot of thank yous, and a lot of people really looking forward to learning more about this book. So I want to thank everyone for participating today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.